your work will forever be connected with Norse mythology. And I remember reading somewhere that it all began with a 19th century old book that was somewhere in your parents' house. Can you tell us a bit about that discovery, that experience, and the way it would affect all your life?
Sure. Even as a kid, I mean, I love mythology, not just Norse mythology, but mythology in general. When I was a kid, you know, we came across the Greek gods and the Roman gods and other stuff. I liked all of it. And I don't know exactly when I discovered the Norse myths. My father, first generation American, my grandparents were from Norway. So I don't claim any genetic affinity. I don't know if it works like that really, but they had a pair of books. My dad had a modest but quite varied library, and they had a pair of books that were from, I want to say 1893. I'd have to go look to be sure about that, but the 1890s sometime, which, you know, when I was a kid wasn't as long ago as it is now, but it was still a long time ago. And one of them was a Greek and Roman mythology volume, and one of them was a Norse myth volume. It was Myths and Legends of Northern Lands or something like that. H.A. Gruber, I think, was the author, whom I did not discover until maybe 10 years ago, was a woman. I think that's probably why she had her initials in the book and not her first name, because back then, I don't know if it would have been quite as acceptable to have a woman writing about that stuff as a guy. But it was a neat book. It was an adult book. It wasn't a book for children. It was pretty detailed. I don't know if all the details were accurate. There's a lot of about Norse mythology we don't know. There are a lot of stories we don't have. We have allusions to them, but not the stories. But there were a lot of quotes in it from the sagas. There were short quotations from the Elder Edda and from the Younger Edda. They were the poetic and the prose Edda, those are our principal sources for the Norse myths. So it was really an introduction to a whole different world that I was accustomed to seeing. And the mythology, the quotes just made it seem more real and more fantastical at the same time. There were illustrations inside. They make me laugh now because there'll be a chapter on Thor, a chapter on Odin, and they'll have a shot of Thor riding his goat chariot and a chapter of Odin sitting on his throne. And they're extremely Greek in their influences in the drawings. They're kind of wearing togas or at least robes, and had the usual, some of them had helmets with big horns on them, which Vikings didn't have. So it had a very classical look to it, by which I mean the Mediterranean, the Greek and Roman affinity in the drawings. It was a while before I got a better look at what Viking costumes really looked like, or Viking clothes really looked like. But it was a neat book. I think part of what probably appealed to me, when you're young, death is a long way away. So it doesn't have the same meaning for you that would have, say, for me now. And the story of the Norse gods and the fact that at the end of time, they're not immortal. They're not immortal to begin with. They have to eat magical fruit from the tree of Idun, which has usually come down as apples, although apparently in the Norse myths, it's not ever actually, I know where I found, labeled as apples. That's kind of a common usage, and I'm using it in my comic Ragnarok. But it's just whatever the fruit is, apples or otherwise, it's what keeps the gods young. And if they don't eat them on a regular basis, they begin to age like ordinary mortals, which is not true for a lot of the gods of other cultures. And then in the end, they face off against their great enemies, all the enemies they've made over the millennia since the gods and the 9 worlds were born. And in the end of it, everybody kills everybody else. Everybody dies. The earth sinks into the ocean. Everything burns. The stars fall from the sky. And then there's a kind of fresh start where the earth comes back up out of the ocean. And I don't know about the stars, but they have the children of the gods. Some of them turned out to have survived by being in the highest halls of Asgard, which did not burn when everything else in the 9 worlds did. And things begin over again. There is some suggestion that some of that stuff is influenced by Christianity as it was coming into the Northlands. I'm not really a scholar of this stuff. That's more than I know. I just know what some of the stories are. But I think the idea that the gods have this great confrontation with their enemies at the end was just fascinating to a kid reading this stuff. It was so different from the other mythologies I'd come across. And it was very powerful. I was in college in the mid-60s, 65, when I discovered Marvel Comics and discovered that they had a comic about the mighty Thor. And I went nuts. I thought, they've got a comic about Thor. And I was thrilled. And it didn't matter that Thor didn't have iron gauntlets or didn't have a red beard. Mine used to be red, by the way, before it turned white. I didn't have a red beard and didn't, whatever, or red hair. But I wasn't a continuity nerd in that sense. I didn't really care. I just was thrilled there was a comic about Thor. And that was really my entry into comics. I mean, I'd read them as a kid. I read a lot of comics as a kid. So I was familiar with them. I loved them. But the kind of comics that Marvel was producing at that time with continued stories and these long-running arcs and these characters that returned in a way, and the fact that the Marvel Universe at that time all felt like one universe, more or less. It felt like one, it started from a big bang and grown outwards. And all that stuff appealed to me. So Thor and mythology were kind of my entry into comics as more of a grown-up, and then comics as a grown-up were my entry into the profession.
It's interesting how many people were introduced to the Norse gods via the Marvel universe through your art and your writing. So it's an interesting cycle to. It
is. I mean, it's nice. I'm thrilled that if my comics had anything to do with the same way that Stan and Jack's comics had a great deal to do with my being in comics today. That's the work that they did, not only on Thor, but other stuff, and then Ditko and the rest of the guys. But Marvel Comics in general had a great deal to do with my getting into comic books. I will tell you a quick story. If this is too boring, we can do something. You can cut this out later. You can edit this out. I have told the story elsewhere, but it's not new in that sense. But when I first discovered Thor and Marvel Comics, it was issue 120 and 121 of Journey into Mystery, which is the beginning of a 4-part story. And I was, as I said, I was thrilled by them. And at the end of the second issue, the issue is the story, this 4-part story is Thor and Loki, rather, revives the Absorbing Man who'd been in one earlier adventure and attacks Asgard, and he wants to overthrow Odin, the usual thing. And he gets the Absorbing Man to fight Thor. And so most of that second issue is Thor and the Absorbing Man going at it. And at the end of the issue, they're coming down to the final blows, and the Absorbing Man can tell this is going to be it, and they're all ready. And suddenly a little kid runs out into the street. And Thor has to stop, turn, grab the kid, put the kid over to the side of the road, and the Absorbing Man clocks him from behind with this great ball and chain. And Thor is lying on the ground, and the Absorbing Man has his arms up in this Jack Kirby position, yelling, "Ha ha, only someone as powerful as Thor could have beaten him." And I didn't know much about comics. I mean, I knew a lot about comics, but not about Marvel Comics. And so I didn't really understand how comics worked at that time. I may have been 18, but it was new to me, as it's new to everybody at some point. So I freaked out. Oh my God, Thor's dead. What happens? So I haunted the store, our local store where I was going to college, for the next issue and never found it. Never turned up. I discovered later on that they didn't get very many Marvel comics in the store. And there was a university town. There was a small college I was at a big state university. And if you weren't in the store looking at a spinner rack, the afternoon the Marvel comics came in, you didn't see them. They were they were gone. They were hot among college kids, and they were gone instantly. So I didn't have to hit Tuesday afternoon at 5 o'clock. So I didn't know, I was going nuts trying to figure what happened. So I wrote to Marvel Comics. I wrote them a letter, which, as I've said elsewhere, I don't have a copy of. I'm glad I don't. I would be embarrassed by it now. But I wrote them and I said, oh my God, this is fabulous. What happened? Is Thor dead? Is there any way I could purchase a copy through you directly so I can see what happened? And weeks went by, and lo and behold, one day, a manila envelope showed up, postmarked New York City. I opened it up. There was a pristine copy of Journey into Mystery 122, which was the next issue. And humorously enough, the splash page is Thor getting back up and going, and the Absorbman yelling and screaming at Thor's behind him now, saying, doesn't he suspect I was merely stunned? I mean, it was like, nothing. It was like a nothing. Just like, okay, let's get going again. Let's go back and fight. But I was thrilled to get it. I was completely blown away they would do it. There was a little card inside, 6x3 card maybe, pre-printed that said, Dear blank, thanks for letting us hear from you. Glad you, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Stan and the gang, all in pre-print. And there was a little extra writing on it. It said, Dear Walter. And at the bottom it said, P.S. Couldn't let you down. Hope you enjoy the issue.
Great.
I became a solid Marvel Comics fan from that second on. I was so blown away by that. It was so nice of them to do it. Many years later, and I kept the note and the comic. Many years later, I had a chance to go to the office when Flo Steinberg was back working there. She'd been the Girl Friday. She'd worked there in the beginning and then left for a while. And then she came back for a while. And I got to know Flo. And I took the note in to show her. And she said, oh, yes, that's my writing. And it was just, I was like, whoa, it was so great to be able to see how that worked. And I was sure it was Flo. I was sure it wasn't Stan. He'd been way too busy to do something like that, I'm sure. But Flo kept track of stuff. I don't know how many comics she sent out. I have no idea. But she sent one to me, and it made an enormous difference in my life. So besides Stan and Jack and Ditko, I owe an enormous debt to Flo Steinberg for helping me get into comic books.
I understand that that your love for comics, and you referenced that, also started very early, and that you had a particular interest in Karl Barks.
Oh, you've done some homework, I see.
Can you tell us a bit about those early years and how comic books gradually took over your life until the time that you already talked about Marvel and the impact that Marvel had? Well,
when I was a child, I had a younger brother, about 3.5 years younger, and we were kids. We liked comics. We read them. My brother did not go into comics professionally. He became a geology professor. But we read comics. We bought them with our allowance, a dime a week or 25 cents a week, whatever our allowances were back in those days. This is in the 1950s. And occasionally our mom would buy us some comics. That didn't happen very often. I had a good friend, a very good friend, close friend, my age, when I was young. He died of childhood leukemia when I was about 10 years old. We were about 10 years old. That was my first intimation about death and about kind of what it meant. But we were very good friends. He drew, I drew. His mom was the piano teacher. He took lessons, I took lessons. I built plastic models, he built plastic models. And Jay and I both read comics, and we had stacks and stacks of comics. So I was reading comics pretty early on, 6 years old, 7 years old, maybe a little earlier even, hard to say now. My folks encouraged us to read. They didn't go out and buy a lot of comics for us. We had to spend our own money for that. But they encouraged it because they wanted to encourage the habit of reading. And they weren't so concerned about what we were reading. As long as we read, that was a good thing. So read a lot of comics, and somewhere in there, young, I came across Walt Disney Comics and Stories, a monthly comic book from Dell Comics. And the lead story in that book was a Carl Barks, Donald Duck story. 8 pages, 10 pages. And the backstory, there'd be a couple little short ones. And then the backstory was a Mickey Mouse story. And the Mickey stories were adventures and usually continued. They ran 2 or 3 or 4 episodes, comics. I don't remember who drew those now. My brain has gone away. I don't know if it was Floyd Godfredson. The name comes up, but I'm not sure he was doing the comics. In any case, I liked those too, but the Barks stuff I loved. And of course, through the Barks comic books, I discovered Uncle Scrooge. The Uncle Scrooge books were coming out, I think, quarterly. And so I read those. And the Donald Duck stories were all kind of goofy, funny stories, many times centered around some new job that Donald had. Apparently, Donald had trouble keeping a job, but he had a lot of jobs, and they were really interesting. They were funny, and they were beautifully written. They were well told, good stories. I find that of the comics I've read, those, for me anyway, worked phenomenally well when I was a child. They work equally well as when I'm an adult. I can still read them. I still enjoy them. I still admire them. I see them a little differently than I saw them when I was a child, but I'm still wowed by them. And the Uncle Scrooge stories were frequently adventure stories of some kind, whether it was the Beagle Boys trying to get Uncle Scrooge's money out of the money bin, whether there was one that I still remember, I thought was fabulous at the time, and I didn't get it until I read it, where Donald and Scrooge dragoons Donald and the boys, as he often did, into a treasure hunt. He bought the records of some old East India shipping company and has gone through all their records, and every penny is accounted for, which is annoying because he's looking for missing money. And then he discovers there was an entire ship that disappeared, full of gold bullion or whatever it was, never to be seen again. Well, that's not quite true. Never to be found again as a living ship. And I don't remember where they came across the record, but the name of the ship, it was like the Vliegende Hollander or something like that. I'm sure that's really awful pronunciation of Dutch. I'm sorry to all the Dutch who are watching this. Please accept my apologies. But they try and track the ship down. It turns out that it occasionally has been sighted down in the southern oceans somewhere. And it's usually seen in the sky with blood red sails sailing against the wind. And I don't know where they discovered this. Somewhere along the way they discovered this. And they don't, Scrooge doesn't pay too much attention to that. In the end, it turns out, Der Vliegende Hollander, or whatever it is, I'm sorry, it's the Flying Dutchman, which is a great legend of a cursed ship. There are a number of stories about it and movies about it. There's kind of a nice movie with Ava Gardner and James Mason. I can't pull the name up right now, where he's a modern Flying Dutchman who's cursed to sail until, I guess, a woman will give her life for him. And in the end, Barks actually has an explanation for what the Flying Dutchman really is and how it worked. I don't know if it would actually work in real life. Doesn't really matter. But it was really cool. It was very exciting. And his stories had both great drama and a lot of humor. I think maybe some of the work I did in Thor, I'm not going to claim any great drama, but there is occasionally humor in the stuff I'm doing. And I think it may come out of Barks. It may be because he has such a nice mixture of the humor and the dramatic together. It's difficult for me to write a completely straight without humor in the book somewhere. I mean, Ragnarok I'm doing now is much grimmer than my old Marvel work and the Thor I did for Marvel. But I've got Ratatusk in there. I've got the squirrel in there. He's sort of a sarcastic guy, doesn't take Thor too seriously. And so as grim as it is, there's still a little leavening of humor here and there in the book. And that probably goes back to Barks. In fact, the Walt Disney Comics and Stories is one of the only 2 comic books that I had a subscription to, or we had a subscription to. I think my parents actually sprung for the subscription because they saw how much we liked it. I don't know if they ever read the book. I wouldn't be surprised if my dad took a look at one once just to see what we were reading, but we never talked about it. He never mentioned it, so maybe not. But, and back then, they're probably in the mid 50s, there weren't any comics that you would have bought as a child that would have been bad for you. They just weren't. I mean, the earlier EC comics, they were pretty grim. Some of them were, and I think my parents might not have approved of me reading them, but they were out when I was really young and not reading comics. I never knew about them until much later. I didn't see any EC comics as a child. But other than that, and the comics we had where I grew up, the Dell comics where I was a kid, were all pretty homogenized. Dell comics are good comics. That was their pledge to parents. And we read everything. I read Classics Illustrated. I read, there were comics based on TV shows like Sugarfoot and Cheyenne, Sea Hunt. There were comics based on movies, Helen of Troy, The Land Unknown, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea from the Disney version, Little Iodine, Little Lulu. I loved Little Lulu, John Stan's Little Lulu, another comic I loved. Very well storytelling was great, very well written, great stories. Little short takes mostly, but they were fantastic. Those are probably maybe my two favorite comics as a kid, the Carl Barks work or the John Stanley work. Twilight Zone, read some of those when they were coming out. So I didn't make any distinction about good comics, bad comics. Superman, Batman. I did have the Superman comic or whatever it was where Supergirl first shows up in the lead story and Metallo is in the back story. I don't have it anymore. I am one of those kids whose mother actually threw out a bunch of their old comics at some point when I had gotten older and moved on, or maybe I was in college. And later in life, she couldn't apologize enough to me for having thrown them away when she just, it turned out what I was doing. But it was just fine. There were two comics I went back and collected again and bought, maybe three, that I knew I had that I was sorry to have lost. But mostly, it didn't matter. I had to convince my mom, no, Mom, really, it's just fine. Don't give it a second thought. But she felt bad about it later.
You lived through the 60s as a teenager and as a young adult. How did the diversity of artistic creation, not limited to comics, the political and social public discussion, and all the counterculture affected your worldview and your subsequent work? Well,
it probably means, it's a hard question to answer, especially when I was that young. I wasn't then, and I'm not now, a particularly political person. I can remember, the United States is very politicized now, enormously so, but so is a lot of the world. And at that time, I wasn't so political. I did go to a few demonstrations. The Vietnam War was quite big for people of my age, for men especially of my age. They certainly affected comics to the extent that there was a lot of experimental work, even in mainstream comics. Jim Steranko comes to mind immediately as a guy that just incorporated a bunch of pop culture references into his work, the work of other guys like Will Eisner, and just took it to some different place. And that was extremely exciting as a comic reader. I was very disappointed that Jim only did about 44 comics or whatever it was. It's a very small number of comics. Every so often I see Jim at conventions. I give him some crap about not doing more comic books. And I just think, come on, you were doing such great work, and it's work that nobody else was doing. And it really blazed some new pathways that I wish you had kept on blazing for a while. I was a geology major in college originally and decided I wanted to study dinosaurs and become a paleontologist. And at the end of my senior year, I decided that was not what I wanted to do. And I had no other ideas at the time. It wasn't like I said, okay, I won't be a paleontologist. Let me go draw comic books. It wasn't like that. In retrospect, it looks like this, okay, here, and suddenly you're in comics. But when you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem so obvious. And so I took a year off. I moved back home. I lived with my parents. I'm sure they were thrilled. I didn't know, that's the stuff when you're young you don't think about very much. But I lived with my parents. I worked in a bookstore, made a few bucks, made minimum wage, and began thinking, also the other thing that happened was I hadn't made a lot of plans out of college once I decided not to go to grad school because I was 21, I was going to be drafted. And I was drafted. I took my physical. I was back home, went to Baltimore with a bunch of other kids in the bus, had a physical at Fort Holabird, which I don't think it exists anymore. One of the ones that was closed down. And I failed it, which I will confess was not the worst day of my life. In my case, I failed it because I wear very thick glasses and I can't see much without them. So I'm probably one of the last guys you want to give a gun full of ammo to and drop off in the jungle. And the doctor told me, he said, well, son, I think I'm going to have to fail you because of your eyes. And I didn't jump up and down for joy, but it meant that my life opened up in front of me again in a way that it had not been for a while. Now, I had drawn pictures from younger than I can remember. My mom tells me that I began drawing when I was 2 or 3, and then I quit. And she was very disappointed because, of course, when you're a parent, you always want your child to be a genius. And she, he's drawing pictures. And then I quit doing it. And she said, that's too bad. But she didn't force me to draw. And then when I was 4 years old, I got mononucleosis. So that's a tiring disease. You're just exhausted all the time. So you're in bed a lot. And back then, I was 4. We didn't have a TV. And of course, no computers, no internet, no any of that stuff. We barely had fire. So my mom we had a little lap board that you could set up with legs. You could set up on a bed, and you could tilt the front of it up. And so she brought me that. And my dad got paper from his work. He would bring home a sheaf of papers, 8.5 by 11. They'd been printed on one side. This is pre-xerography, so I'm not sure what they were doing, dittos or mimeographs. They weren't the purple ink, it was black ink. But they were printed and then they were thrown away when they were done. There were charts and all kinds of professional stuff. My dad was a soil scientist, and so it was all this scientific stuff. So he would bring home the paper they were thrown out, and that would go in a drawer of his desk, right in the front, in a slot. And my brother and I, that was our paper. We could do whatever we wanted. Make water bombs, paper airplanes, or draw on it. And we did all this, and make hats, make sailing boats. We did all that stuff. And so I drew. My mom gave me a bunch of paper and some pencils. I started drawing again when I had mono. I really never quit after that. I just kept drawing. But my dad was a scientist. My younger brother became a geologist. And I didn't know anybody who was a freelance artist. I had no idea what that meant or how that would work. So when I was living after college, I was living at home, I decided to apply to art schools. There were all these possibilities, I guess. That was part of the time. And among others, I applied to the Rhode Island School of Design in Providence, Rhode Island. And the short version is I was accepted there. I went in as a transfer student. I had a degree already. I was still reading comics, but I began drawing them. And one comic, Star Slammers, which was a pulp science fiction hack work, my own hack work, I began drawing that as a degree, as a project, actually, my junior year. And then it lapped over to my senior year as my degree project. So it became essentially my senior thesis. I wrote it, I lettered it, I penciled it, I inked it. It was in black and white. Eventually, I bound it up in a book. The second half. The first half is not bad fan work. And the second half is marginally professional. And so the second half became my portfolio. And when I graduated from RISD, I came to New York with my portfolio looking for work in comics, and I was able to find it. So it all seems very straightforward when you explain it like that, but at the time you're in the middle of it, it doesn't seem so obvious that's how it's all going to work out. I had visions of working at McDonald's for a long time after that.